Godwin Emefiele, CBN governor. Well, let's get to the markets now. In the absence of any catalyst to drive positive sentiment, the Nigerian equities market sustained its bearish run on Thursday. The benchmark index declined by 1.86%, the largest loss since May 27, 2019, to 29,712.90 points, weighed by sell-offs in MTN Nigeria and Airtel Africa. Well, let's bring in Temple to give us the details. Hello, Temple. Good morning. Well, the market has continued to nosedive. What is upsetting investors this time?
Well, you said it all. The fact that there's no catalyst in the market, there's no news at this point to drive up the performance. A lot of foreign and domestic investors are really not too concerned about equities at this point in time due to the fact that there's no major push or motivation to help them put money on ground or bet on some of those key picks that used to take the mind of investors in recent times. So basically yesterday, we lost some 265 billion naira. And if you look at the activity level, things were totally negative. The volume of transaction was down 4.61%. Value of the transaction as well was down by 3.75%. In fact, the deals that we had at 3,105 was also down by some 22.9% in total. And basically year-to-date, losses expanded to some 8.65%. We had 10 gainers and 18 losers in the market, and of course, just 78 companies remain unchanged. These are companies, of course, that would have, attracted the performance or the funds, the good money that investors basically have in hand. The downtrend was basically impacted by Airtel, MTN, CCNN, Nestle, which is a major heavyweight in the market, of course, Honeywell Flour under the consumer goods segment of the market. And if you go by what we have in the sectoral performance of the market, the banking side of the market was about the only one that moderated by some 0.64% yesterday. And of course, the marginal gain that we have in the oil and gas space. The oil and gas space, if you look at Corn Oil is about the only company that post the release of its numbers, its FY 2018 numbers, has released some dividend proposal to investors. I think it's thinkable. So you saw that moving yesterday upward by some 0.25%. Some smart investors trying to take the little gain they can make out of that. If we move further to the unlisted securities market, we saw that contracting by some 2.61% yesterday. Some 14.9 billion naira was lost yesterday on that side of the market, and we saw the value of transactions streaming by 4.3%. Market activity measured by the aggregate volume up was over 1,000% yesterday, and we saw the likes of Afriland, Air Liquid, and Capa del Beto, making some good gains there yesterday. On a final note, we've got the bonds and the treasury bill side of the market. Generally speaking about the fixed income market, yesterday we saw investors basically looking at the buy side of things. That market was buy side driven yesterday. We saw for the bonds side of the market, bonds declined by 13 basis points on the average. And of course, that's on the CBN directive as it relates to standing deposit facilities for some 2 billion naira and more. For the treasury bill side of the market, the 105-day to maturity bill was down yesterday by 164 basis points to some 9.57% basically yesterday, Chimeze.
All right, Temple, and you did have an interview with one of the experts in the insurance sector talking about restructuring of the office of the by the National Office of the National Health Insurance Scheme that came up earlier in the month, and you had an interview with Mrs. Adesimbo Ukiri, who tells you on how this sector needs to be more focused on recapitalization for the HMOs. Let's take a listen.
It's important for every country in the world. You would see that there is actually a relationship between the state of the health of the population and the level of productivity and economic activity that goes on in the country. So, I mean, in Nigeria, we're struggling. We've been struggling for quite a while with our healthcare sector, and we have lots of issues with it. But I'm happy to see new developments. I'm happy, even Healthcare Limited is a health maintenance organization. We're at HMO. So we're very relieved with the recent announcement of a new executive secretary to the National Health Insurance Scheme. So this is a movement in the right direction. So we're happy for it, and we're looking forward to what else the new administration has in store for the healthcare sector.
So it's good to know you actually mentioned the NHIS because that's an institution that just got kind of restructured. With the coming of Professor Mohammed Sambu now as the new executive secretary, what are your expectations from him? We know that there's been a whole lot of turbulence in that regulatory space.
Our expectations are actually quite high because he used to be part of the NHIS. He had worked in the NHIS for many, many years in the past. He'd worked in various parts of the country as well. So initially, at some point, it was the AGM in charge of the Southwest region. He was based in Lagos. He's been also an AGM overseeing, the administrative work going on in the Northwestern region as well. He was based in Kaduna. He was also in charge of, I think, the first initial launch of the community health insurance programs that the NHIS did way back then. So he's someone who's very familiar with the NHIS as an institution and with the relevant stakeholders that makes what the NHIS is seeking to achieve for the country, the stakeholders that the NHIS works with in order to achieve success. So he's someone we're very happy to have on that seat, and we're looking forward to great things that he will achieve. But I must say that we have our own expectations. We have what we hope he will focus on, and the first of this is the regulatory framework under which we operate. Earlier on this year, in about April, there was a National Health Insurance Commission bill that had passed all the readings in the House, and the House of Senate had passed it on to the President. We're hoping for three things from this bill. The first thing we're hoping for is that health insurance will be made compulsory for all Nigerians, because that's the only way to achieve universal health coverage. We're also hoping for a clear articulation of the functions of the NHIS as a regulator. Right now, the NHIS sometimes is very often confused. It's an operator as well as a regulator. It's an operator that competes with other operators like us. An operator cannot even regulate itself, so it shouldn't exist as an operator. It should be a regulator. Sometimes as well it also acts like a fund manager because there's so much money that it has in its coffers. I think all this it creates conflict of interest, lack of focus. So we are hoping that the National Health Insurance Commission bill that is awaiting presidential assent will address these issues. There's also the fact that in recent times many state governments have started their own health insurance schemes, which is amazing. It is what we want to happen. But all of this still has to be regulated within one common regulatory framework, and all the funds that are accumulated need to go into one universal national pool of funds so that we can effectively reach every nook and cranny of the country. So these are the three things we're hoping for within the National Health Insurance Commission bill, and we hope it will soon be signed into law.
So you actually talked about channeling or managing of some pool of funds to get the industry going better. How would you want that to be managed? Do you want it taken back to the central bank, or you want a new institution created for that?
Honestly, that is not an area that we would want to concern ourselves with. What we would like to see is to ensure that the funds are being administered for the use and the intention that they were accumulated for. So for instance, we need to be paid on time in order that we can make the relevant payments to the hospitals. We need to have, adequate data. I mean, this brings me to another area that we would like the new ES to also focus on a bit, and that's got to do with, the IT infrastructure, as well as the accumulation of data and the consolidation of data of everything that occurs within the National Health Insurance Scheme's purview. We HMOs are obligated to submit annual audited financial statements. And for every other industry, this is public information. You can go to NICOM now, and you would get the published annual statements of all the insurance companies. You could go to CBN and you get everything for the banks. You can't go to the NHIS and be able to retrieve any audited financial statement for any of the HMOs. I think this is part of what we think the ES needs to look at. He needs to look at reforming the entire sector. He needs to look at the financial strength of the players that are within the sector. He needs to look at capital adequacy. He needs to look at liquidity. He needs to look at, what they have in their reserves. He needs to look at the risk management frameworks within which they operate. And you'd find out that most likely, about 60 HMOs that exist right now, if he were to apply international standards of financial strength and capabilities to them, maybe we would reduce to 12, maybe 10, who knows? But, you know, yes, so recapitalization and, you know, more stringent liquidity framework for us to operate within. When this is done, then, you know, there will be less focus on who has what funds, who keeps what funds. We should be able to manage our operations with the capital that we have invested in our companies. And if we're, you know, operating as a pass-through for the NHIS to pay to hospitals on plans that are within the purview of the federal government or the state government, that's all we should be. We're not investors. We shouldn't be angling to invest, you know, funds that are meant to look after the healthcare of people.
And talking about reforms and recapitalization, how much do you think can be achieved given the constraints that we have in the economy right now? You have the banking sector recapitalization coming up. You have the broader insurance space recapitalization. You have micro finance banks recapitalization. And here you are suggesting a recapitalization in the HMOs segment of the economy or of the markets.
I think it's absolutely an imperative for us to get this kind of reform done. I mean, if we just compare the adequacy of capital across all these three sectors that you mentioned, for instance, you have HMOs, capitalization requirement for HMOs is 400 million. In life insurance, for instance, they've just issued a new regulation that requires the minimum capitalization for companies to engage in life insurance to move from 3 billion to 9 billion. I mean, HMOs at 400 million, what are we talking about here? At the end of the day, money will go where there is an assurance of return on investment. And I think for too long as a country, we have continued to view health as a social good and not necessarily as an area that is ripe for business opportunities, that is ripe for investment. And once we put all the necessary framework in place, we have an effective and efficient regulator, we will be able to attract investment into healthcare and precisely into healthcare management, you know, and I think this is something that we simply need to do. Penetration is so low. It costs money to invest in IT infrastructure. It costs money to invest in the marketing and the awareness that drives change in consumer behavior. If we don't have the right levels of investment, I fear that we would still be just scratching the surface of the opportunities that exist.
How much do you see being achievable at the NHIS without a board? Because the initial board was actually dissolved by the federal government a few weeks ago.
I think it's absolutely necessary for the board to be reconstituted as quickly as possible, because under the currently existing regulation, the National Health Insurance Act, which we operate, the terms are very clear. There needs to be a council. There are many obligations and responsibilities that fall on the council. The executive secretary also has its own its own obligations and duties, and he can't usurp the duties of the council. I'm also aware that under the National Health Insurance Commission bill, which has been passed on to the president, there is also a sector that deals with the powers and the duties and the obligations of the council. So it would be like a CEO of a company operating without a board. These are the organs of governance, of good governance. So it's something we're looking forward to, and we believe it should happen very quickly as well.
In terms of the perception of our health management organizations, what are your views and what's the best approach to adopt to remedy this sort of bad image that HMOs now have in the system?
Yeah, it's one that is constantly evolving, and I have to say that it's actually in a much better place now than it was, say, 5 years ago or 7 years ago. And we've gotten there through constant education and enlightenment. First was the understanding we sought to put out there that we have the private health insurance, and then we have the state federal government-run health insurance scheme, which is the NHIS. Now we also have state government running their own health insurance schemes. And as it is with all things, you will have varying levels of performance and quality depending on which one you choose. But be that as it may, I think one of the things that can give trust to Nigerians where our sector is concerned is to have a regulator that is transparent. If I were, just a Nigerian that wanted to take a decision which HMO to go for instance, if I could go to a website somewhere and I would see the financial statements, I would be able to have access to quarterly or monthly data on how much claims they have paid. What is the percentage of claims to premiums? You know, how long does it take them to answer to member inquiries that call to their call center? What are the kind of statistics? These are things that in other parts of the world, HMOs are required to submit to their regulator on a monthly basis. And they are published every quarter. So how can we build trust? We build trust by making information about our activities, our operations, widely available to all Nigerians to have access to. Transparency is what builds trust.
So you have a new competitor in town, and that's crowdfunding. How are you coping with that?
Honestly, it's interesting you should say that, because myself and a few other colleagues have been discussing of recent that crowdfunding is not really a competition. It's a bit scary, to be honest, because by the time people resort to crowdfunding, you will discover that whatever condition they are crowdfunding for, it's at the final stages. So you see people crowdfunding already when there's a cancer in stage 3 or stage 4 and they want to ship the person abroad. You see people crowdfunding when there's been a renal failure, the person's on dialysis and cannot survive and they're waiting for an organ transplant. You see crowdfunding in really, really extreme cases, and it doesn't need to get that bad. If that person you tried to crowdfund had a health insurance plan or was, had already subscribed to some kind of health insurance cover, things wouldn't get that bad. One of the key advantages of going under a health insurance cover is that you catch conditions, you catch ailments, you catch illnesses just at the infancy when they're beginning to come out. And it costs far less to treat them at that level than it costs to treat them when they get advanced. In addition to that as well, if you also are subscribed to a health insurance cover of some sort, there are many wellness and preventive initiatives that we constantly roll out that will even help to prevent you from catching or from, developing such a condition in the first place. So it's not a competition at all. It's actually, it's a symptom of something that's really bad that we need to deal with.
Well, that was Adesimbo Ukiri, the Chief Executive Officer of Avon Health Management, speaking there on the need for health insurance. We'll take a break now, and when we come back, we will look at the recent inequality report published by Oxfam. Do stay with us.